Hello, welcome to the IU Northwest Community Garden presentation, Common Garden Diseases and Other Ailments. My name is Leslie Kaiser, the garden coordinator, and I'll be serving as one of the moderators. Rebecca Koetz is our presenter today. Rebecca is the Lake County Urban Agriculture Extension Educator through Purdue Extension. She works out of the Crown Point office. She graduated from Purdue with degrees in wildlife and forestry and natural resources. She enjoys growing vegetables and food for pollinators in her own yard. She also enjoys helping people grow their own food and enjoy the outdoors. She can be reached at busser@purdue.edu.
Hey, thank you so much, Leslie and Amanda. First, I'd like to credit Gail Rule, who is a plant disease diagnostician at Purdue, who created kind of like the foundation for this presentation, and I've kind of put this local twist on it for the region. So all of the information I'm sharing is based on common questions that come into the office through our helpline that normally our master gardeners run, and they do a great job. But because of COVID, I've been getting a lot of the calls directly, which is a great way for me to learn really the issues that are going on, the most common concerns that are going on in the region. So hopefully I can help some of you with the issues that you're seeing. And also, why should we care about common diseases? All of you stated reasons why we should care. But if we think about the world's dependence on plants for things like food, timber, everything that's made of wood or cotton, our clothing, and just aesthetics, we really need our plants to be as healthy as possible to get the most out of them. And then if we think about learning from history and diseases that have really shaken our economy and the health of our food system, the Irish potato famine was the result of a disease of potatoes. A lot of us are still dealing with the emerald ash borer in the present day. So these are things that we can learn from in order to help us catch diseases early on, diagnose them and treat them so that we can really get the most out of our plants. And when I say plants, I know the title of the presentation is garden, but I'll talk about vegetable gardens. I'll talk about diseases that affect trees and shrubs and ornamentals, and some that affect all of them. So hopefully we'll help different people that way. And when I'm talking about a disease, I'm talking about any physiological or structural abnormality that is harmful to the plant. So some structural abnormalities aren't so harmful, some are more harmful than others, some we have recommended solutions, and some it's just kind of not as necessary to take action. My cat's trying to come up into the presentation, so she might pop in. A pest is a destructive insect or other animal that attacks crops, food, livestock. So just because we see an insect in our garden or on our trees doesn't necessarily make it a pest. Sometimes they're actually really beneficial predators that are attacking the pests and keeping those pest populations down. So we'll talk about the differences between those and some of the most common pests that we see in our area. And some of the vocabulary that I'll be using today, a symptom is how the plant expresses the disease. So it's just how it responds. So it could be that the plant changes color. A sign is the actual pest or fungal fruiting body. So you might see the actual pest, or you might see a fungus or something, or the frass that's left behind. The insect poop might be a sign. The vector is how a disease is transmitted. Pests oftentimes are disease transmitters. They're vectors, and we'll talk about that. Also, pesticide, insecticide, fungicide, all these different words. Insecticides kill insects, fungicides kill fungi, and pesticides kill all of the above. So even though it has the word pest, we can be talking about weeds, insects, fungi, all of the above. The word organic, it just means that it's made of organic compounds, non-synthetic compounds. So if you use an organic versus an inorganic fertilizer or pesticide, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's safer to use. It's definitely based on your own decision, your values, and why everybody has their own reasons for going organic or not going organic. But overall, you should still always read the label for your pesticide, read the label for your fertilizer so that you can use it safely. and appropriately. So just to reiterate, plant disease symptoms is what the plant does in response to that disease or pest. The signs are the actual physical disease or pest. And there's lots of different ways, lots of different vectors and agents of plant disease. So we'll actually, and conditions. So we'll talk about diseases, and then we'll also talk about conditions that come from things like mechanical injury, thinking about our lawnmowers and pruning tools and garden tools. Also chemicals like fertilizers and pesticides can actually cause harm to the garden if used inappropriately. Also environmental conditions like weather, flooding, where the plant is located and if it's in an appropriate site. And then also, of course, our pathogens. And I'll mention two different types of plant diseases. We have our non-infectious and our infectious diseases. Our non-infectious are these abiotic diseases like our environmental issues, issues in the soil having to do with nutrition or salt, or different things like that. That's not an infectious pathogen caused disease. So a lot of times these diseases are seen uniformly across species, all just based on where the plants are located. And then our infectious diseases are usually caused by biotic pathogens like our pests, our fungi, and they're more random. The symptoms and signs seem more random. For example, if we look at an individual plant on the left here, we'll see that in this individual tree, there are lots of random brown patches of branches. And so that's likely a biotic condition, maybe a fungal infection, versus this plant on the right. This tree has a more uniform condition. Just the top of the tree seems to be defoliated. It's losing its leaves. And so this individual plant might be suffering more from an abiotic condition. So maybe its roots aren't getting enough oxygen. It looks like it's planted in a more urban environment. So it might not be getting the nutrition that it needs and getting the nutrients up through the root system. So that's likely more abiotic. So these are ways that you can tell just by a quick look what you're dealing with likely. And then some other examples, we'll see this photo on the left, or this kind of random blotchy patches is more likely a biotic infectious disease, like a fungal disease in this lawn, versus the pictures on the right. The top right, we see all of the trees along the side of the road, especially the side facing the road, seem to have this browning. So this browning is likely a cause from something like salt spray, which is an abiotic, non-infectious condition. So the trees behind these trees can't catch this disease from the trees. It's an abiotic condition, not so much a disease. And then the tree on the bottom has this ring around it. So it's on the turf, it's likely cause of like an inappropriate pesticide application. And then if we look at individual hosts, we'll see, for example, these house plants on the right, two different species of plants exhibiting the same symptom shows that this condition is not host specific, so it's likely not infectious. And so that's kind of contradictory to like what I had just mentioned, but if you see the same kind of spotting pattern or a very similar pattern across species in the same area, it's likely not infectious, versus if you see only spotting or a specific condition only on a certain kind of tree or plant, but then plants in the surrounding area that are very close by aren't exhibiting that, it's likely host specific, only that kind of species has that condition, so it's more likely a biotic condition, a disease. So at this point, are there any questions in the chat or any that somebody would like to make verbally? So if they had similar symptoms, then they would both have an abiotic condition likely. If you had two different species, like in this house plant, these two house plants, they're not the same species, but they both have this spotting, it's likely not to be a biotic disease. It's likely to do with like how much water they're getting, how much nutrition, or how much light they're getting, versus if only one of the plants were exhibiting it, but they were both on the same windowsill, they were both on the same in the same room, they have the same conditions, then it's likely a biotic condition, a living agent like a fungal infection or a pest. That's also a good question. Does it help the plant to prune off abiotic parts? Likely no, because the reason for the abiotic condition is that something's happening in the area, in the soil, that is damaging the plant. So it's likely because the plant is planted in an area that it's not going to do well, or it's getting salt spray from the road, or it's poor nutrition in the soil. And I'll talk more about that soon. So yeah, abiotic conditions not always helpful to remove the plant parts. It's more likely the location of the plant that's affecting it. Okay, so now we're going to get more specifically into abiotic conditions. So a lot of times abiotic conditions are caused by things like temperature or moisture extremes, things like flooding or drought, nutrient imbalances, pesticide injury, or drift from another location. So not even if it doesn't have to be that you're using the pesticide, it could come from a neighboring farm or neighboring yard. Improper cultural practices, planting in the wrong place, genetic factors, and usually we see this uniform pattern. So this example here of leaf scorch can happen because of too much sunlight or not enough water for the plant. And so in that case, this plant is probably not suited to the site, or it needs to be watered more. Some other examples of moisture extremes, blossom end rot is an example. It's due to a calcium deficiency for tomatoes. So you'll see this rotting of the underside of the tomatoes. But if you just add calcium, it's not going to fix the problem, because it's actually a result of inconsistent watering. So if sometimes the plant gets too much water and sometimes it doesn't get enough water, this inconsistent watering can cause this condition. So you can apply calcium, but then you have to make sure that it's getting a consistent amount of water. And the rule of thumb is typically about 1 inch of water a week. So if nature provides that to you, if we get about 1 inch of rain that week, you don't necessarily have to water. And if you're not sure, you can stick your finger about 1 inch down into the soil to see if it's dry. If it's dry, then you can water. And we'll talk more about best watering practices in a little bit. Cat facing is also a result of inconsistent watering. We have a lot of tomato examples because they're really popular. And also leaf yellowing can mean not enough water or too much water. So these are questions you have to ask: is this plant getting about 1 inch of water a week? Sticking your finger into the soil to see if it's dry or not, these kinds of questions. Also, temperature extremes can cause cracking or wind. So some ways that you can prevent this is by wrapping the tree to winterize it. So you can wrap the tree with burlap or a light colored cover. You don't want to paint it necessarily, and you want to avoid dark colors, and you want to make sure to remove the coverings in the spring after the last frost, because you don't want to cook your tree, because that can be an issue too. And then in the fall before winter, you can also help winterize it by mulching the tree. So you want to create a good sized mulched area, and make sure to water it thoroughly and fertilize it in the fall so that it's prepared for winter. I had mentioned nutrient deficiencies, and pH issues are actually really common. So if you see a tree or a plant that's just yellow and it's just not doing well, also really small leaves and poor growth, like some people mentioned that their crops are just not growing well. They're yellow, or the vegetables are just not growing very quickly. It's likely a soil condition. So the first thing that I always recommend is a soil test. And a soil test is not very it's pretty affordable. So a basic soil test can run you anywhere from $10 to $20. You can get a kit that's like ready to mail into the ready to put into the mail from the extension office. So you can contact your local county extension office, which is in Crown Point if you're in Lake County, and they'll either mail you one, or you can just come and pick one up by appointment because of COVID. And then you can do the soil test and usually get the results back within just like a week or two, actually, and determine what nutrition you have. And it's actually not recommended to apply fertilizer unless you know you should. So based on a soil test. So some people get in the habit of applying fertilizer regularly because they know that's a healthy part of growing plants. But if your soil already has enough nitrogen, enough phosphorus, then if adding more nitrogen, more phosphorus can actually damage your plant. And we have a lot of issues also with high soil pH in this area. So we have very alkaline soils. So this can affect how nutrients are absorbed into the plant. And this is demonstrated by chlorosis, which just means yellowing or a change in color for the trees. So a soil test is the first thing to do. And if you do it through the extension office, I get a copy of the report, you get a copy of the report, and we can talk about it. Some other examples of mechanical damage are things like herbicide injury. Like I mentioned, this shows up as kind of like funky looking leaf shapes. They can be curly or extra shiny, and you just know something's wrong. Fluoride toxicity from city water. Not to say city water is bad, but it can be harmful to especially houseplants. So if you can use like a filtered water that doesn't have fluoride, then that can help. Also, we see a lot of mechanical damage, especially when people use lawn services, not to bash lawn services, but a lot of times if someone's like, I don't know what's going on with my tree or my lawn, the first question I ask is are you managing your lawn or your trees, or is someone else doing it for you? Because then we can start to make these connections. So if you accidentally run over your tree's roots and make a gash, that can actually cause girdling and restrict. It's kind of like cutting off circulation for your tree to get the nutrients and water that it needs. And talking about girdling, proper tree planting is a great way to just, it's necessary to start your tree off healthy and get it growing strong. A lot of times people will mention to me that the tops of their tree are dying, or just half of the tree is dying. And sometimes it's because the roots are being restricted. So it's like cutting off circulation to part of your body, so the nutrients and the water aren't getting up through the tree. And this can actually be made worse if we mulch like a volcano. So we see this picture on the bottom is what we call volcano mulching, which is pretty common around here. And that can actually cause the base of the tree the wood to decay. So we try to avoid that. You really only want like 2 to 3 inches of mulch around the base of the tree. And we want to leave actually a small gap of about 2 inches between the start of the mulch and the start of the tree, just to give it room and to not lead to decaying. I put a link to a video in the PowerPoint presentation that you all are going to get a copy of that you can visit. And this has a great video on proper tree planting. It's very common for trees to be planted too deeply. And when the tree's planted too deeply, you don't see this root flare, which you're seeing in this picture here. So if the tree is just straight up and down in the ground, you don't have the root flare, and that can also lead to the base of the tree, the wood, decaying. Another common issue is transplant shock. So if you have a tree that's not doing so well, but it was only planted a couple of years ago, give it time. You can check these other conditions, make sure it's planted appropriately, make sure that there's no leaf spotting or other strange conditions. But if it's just not growing in well yet, give it time. It can take like 2 or 3 years for a tree or another plant to get established. Some other site disturbances could be compaction if there was recent construction, or if there's a lot of foot traffic even in an area. So you might divert the foot traffic away from an area if you're seeing some issues like leaves aren't growing in properly, or you're seeing some dead branches that can restrict the growth of the tree. And also, besides the excessive mulch that we mentioned, pavement. So we see these little tiny open bare ground spots where people plant these trees that are supposed to get huge. And most of the tree's roots are within like a foot or 6 inches of the ground surface. So they're actually growing out more than they're growing deep. And so when you have pavement right up to the base of the tree, it's not getting the oxygen that the roots need. They're not getting the water that they need, because all of the water is going to the base of the tree instead of to the roots that it needs to be. So it's best just not to plant a large tree in a space this small. You can plant something smaller that doesn't have as large a root system. Also, poor sites. If you have an area that floods a lot, or if you're wanting to plant near a downspout, keep in mind that plants that don't tolerate flooding well won't do well in these sites. So you can check out your local county extension office. You can look online for extension websites, or even Morton Arboretum is a great site to see if your plant that you're considering planting in that location does well with flooding. Are there any questions at this point?
Looks like we have a question from Carolyn. She's asking about water treated with water softener salt, and is this potentially a hazard for plants?
Yeah, so water treated with water softener salts. I personally have noticed there being some issue with my houseplants. I don't see it as much with the vegetable crops, but if you can definitely get like excess salt, and that can kind of change the composition of your soil, and that can become an issue. So if you have like, for my house, the water spigot outside isn't connected through the water softener system, just the inside, like water is connected through the water system, the softener system. So if you have a way of getting water that's not connected through your water softener, that will likely do better with your plants. And I don't necessarily know the reason why, except that salts can change the composition of your soil and prevent the uptake of nutrients. But yeah, it definitely can make a difference. So if you notice some changes, then that might be the reason.
Okay, Lupe has a question. Can anything be done to deal with tree roots that are growing at the ground level surface and pushing up bricks?
Yeah, so that was so tree roots growing at the ground, at the surface, pushing up bricks is likely an improper planting location. Unfortunately, that happens a lot, and it's hard to tell, like, based on like, okay, the site, like this tree's been here forever, and eventually it outgrows its location. That happens a lot, but it's not generally recommended to cut the roots of the tree. You can, but the tree might not be the same after that. You might, it might not be as stable, or it might not be as healthy as it was before. If possible, it's best to just remove the bricks or change. It's easier to either just remove the tree or change the path, or change the location of the bricks. And that will be more likely to preserve the health. But that is something I want to look more into, so thank you. I'm going to make a note to look more into that.
We have a question from John. What happens when the metals from city water get into the plant?
Yeah, so the metals I haven't heard as much from. So the city water is actually on really strict testing regimens. If you're on city water, you can be pretty safe about your any sort of toxins getting into your plants, like your vegetable crops, if you're thinking about that. The main thing is just like the fluoride could potentially lead to some damage on like house plants in particular. But as far as like if you aren't on city water, then it is recommended to get water testing, like if you're on well water, because it's not as stringently restricted. But city water is they're required to do really stringent testing, so it's not really an issue. Now we're getting into these infectious biotic diseases. So there are a lot of different plant pathogens that can cause these biotic diseases, and I'm not talking about pests yet, that's the next section. But I'm really just focusing on fungi, bacteria, and viruses because they are the most common in this area. First, we have to think of the disease triangle. So what we need in order for an infection to occur is a susceptible host. So the host has to be susceptible, the pathogen itself, and the right environmental conditions. So we have to keep those in mind. Here are some examples of fungal issues. But first, thinking about fungi, a lot of people, you might be scared thinking about like, oh, there's mushrooms on my tree, or there's slime mold in my mulch. What is this? Is it safe? Those are actually saprophytes. So those are organisms that are obtaining nutrients from dead or decaying organic matter. They're not going to harm your vegetable crops. They're not harming the living tree or the living parts of your lawn. They're just decomposing what's already decaying there, and that's their job. That's their niche in life, is just to break down that organic matter. So actually 10% of the fungi on Earth account for approximately 75% of all plant diseases, but most fungi, so the rest of the fungi on Earth actually aren't actually don't cause diseases. They just act as these decomposers. So 90% of fungi are not pathogens. So these wood rotter mushrooms shown on this tree, or the little mushroom caps popping up on a lawn, they're not doing any damage. They're just decomposing the decayed organic matter. When we think about fungal infections, water is necessary for spore movement and infection. So whether it be rain or overhead irrigation, which we'll talk about, water is necessary. Powdery mildew is a very common fungal infection, and it's actually one of the few fungi that don't need water. They just use the humidity in the air to spread. And the number one way to prevent powdery mildew, which is just this like white powdery on leaf surfaces, the way to prevent that the best is to get resistant varieties. So you can do your research into your plants or into your seeds and find varieties that are resistant against powdery mildew. Also give them enough air circulation. So make sure to spread the plants out as much as recommended. And you can also prune suckers off of plants like tomatoes. You can prune those suckers, make sure that they're getting enough air circulation. Also for trees, pruning around them to get enough air circulation. Make sure that that plant isn't in the shade if it's not supposed to be in the shade. Powdery mildew is very common in greenhouses in particular. So just really hot, humid, wet conditions is how powdery mildew survives. If you do end up with powdery mildew, then you can avoid overhead irrigation. So just water at the base of the plant instead of watering overhead or using a sprinkler system, which is consistent across all fungal infections. It's recommended to just to avoid using overhead irrigation. And also we have some fungicides that are preventative that we can use. So a copper or sulfur-based fungicide is an organic method of preventative fungicide. So if I apply a fungicide to the leaves that are affected by powdery mildew, I'm not going to get rid of the powdery mildew that's already there, but I'll prevent it from infecting the rest of the plant, keep it from getting worse. And that's true of all fungicides. They're just preventative. They're not going to treat the problem that's already there. They're just going to prevent it from spreading. And I know a couple of people mentioned or at least one person mentioned spotting on tomatoes. This is a very common condition with tomatoes that is a Septoria leaf spot. That is a fungal infection. And it appears as spotting with little gray centers. So there are these tan spots with little gray centers on the surface of the leaves, and it starts on the bottom leaves of the plant, which are the older leaves, and then it spreads upwards if it's not taken care of. And it doesn't really infect the fruit. So if you notice that your tomato plant, the tomatoes themselves are being infected, like the fruits of the tomatoes are being affected, you likely have another condition present. The Septoria leaf spot just infects the leaves. So some ways that you can help with this condition is you can mulch around your plant. So this picture on the top does not have mulch. I can add mulch by putting like dried out grass clippings or straw or even wood chips, but wood chips are a little harder to plant in. And you just create like a nice like 2-inch layer of mulch around the plant, and that will keep water from splashing soil back up onto the plant. And the fungus will actually live in the soil and the water, so you have to keep that from splashing back up. So that's the reason for using mulch. Also avoiding overhead irrigation, of course, and then removing the infected plants at the end of the year. So if you do get an infection, it's really necessary to remove them at the end of the year and rotate your crops if possible. So that's just good practice generally for the health of the plant. Different plant families have different diseases that affect them. So if I have tomatoes in one place and it gets a disease, even if it doesn't get a disease, I'm not going to plant anything else in that same family. So no peppers, no eggplants, no tomatoes in that garden bed for a few years, just to let the fungus that's already in the soil in the area, just to let that dissipate. If you do have an infection, there are fungicides that contain copper, chlorothalonil, or mannab that can help you. So you can spray it on the leaves that aren't infected to prevent those leaves from being infected. And when you do remove the plants at the end of the year, you don't want to compost them. You can burn them, bury them, or bag and dispose of them just so that they don't infect other plants through the compost. Anthracnose is a general kind of umbrella for different fungal infections. It affects a variety of different plants, a lot of shade trees, and it shows up as this kind of browning of leaf margins or edges, or browning of in between the leaf veins. So if you notice, it kind of looks like some of these leaves, someone colored in between the veins with like a dark marker or dark crayon. And so that shows up as anthracnose. And so these are specific to host plants. So if you have like maple trees that have anthracnose, they can't infect your oak trees. So, but they can infect other maple trees. So it's host specific. And it requires water to spread. Some ways that you can take care of this. And so it doesn't necessarily mean you have to apply fungicide to take care of these things. If possible, cultural practices can really help you reduce the disease over time. So it can take a few years just to get the disease out of the system. So you can help your plants by raking and removing the fallen leaves before winter. Or you can mulch them, like if you just have a bunch of trees and there's no way you're going to rake all the leaves and remove them, just mulching them with your lawnmower can help dissipate the disease in the area. Also avoid overhead or sprinkling irrigation. Prune the trees. So pruning is actually part of healthy tree maintenance. Mulching and planting appropriately. So planting in the right location. Because this disease does thrive in cool, wet springs. It's best to plant. It's good to plant based on your location appropriately by doing your research. I do want to throw in this information about tar spot. Tar spot affects maples primarily in this area. We see it as these raised tar-like bumps that start out as just like little yellow or brown bumps on the leaf surfaces, but then they'll raise and turn into these really distinctive tar spots. Generally, no action is needed. You can just rake or mulch and remove the leaves. And over time, this disease will dissipate from the area. Nectria Canker is a kind of disease, a fungal disease that enters through wounds. So if you pruned at the wrong time or pruned too deeply or had mechanical injury on the tree or weather damage or some sort of entryway for the disease to get into the tree, that's how this happens. And you'll notice that it looks kind of like a soggy part of the tree, like a soggy knot on the tree. So it can kind of seem like it's seeping almost. And sometimes you'll actually see these little fruiting bodies on the tree around the canker. So in order to treat this, you would prune any infected branches 6 inches below the infected area, dispose of those branches, burning, burying, or bagging and throwing them away. And then also proper watering, fertilizing, and pruning. If you do see this picture on the bottom left, this tree has formed these callus rings around the canker. It's treating itself. At this point, you don't have to do anything, especially if you see a canker on the trunk of a tree, this will happen. And so this tree is solving its own problem. You don't have to do anything at this point. It is not recommended to cover the tree with anything, no paint, no plastic or liners or anything like that, because that can actually slow down the healing process of the tree. Cherry black knot is a common disease. This was actually one of the first diseases I saw in my position. It's very highly infectious among cherries, plums, and sometimes peaches. It forms these really characteristic black spongy knots around the branches. So it actually girdles the branches, so it cuts off circulation, and it can become really difficult to save the tree. So the best thing you can do is plant appropriately, choose resistant varieties. If you do get an infection, you can prune behind the infection, so like 6 inches back, cut it out, or if it is on the trunk, cut with like a clean knife, cut about 1 inch deeper than the actual infection, which you'll be able to tell it's this like really characteristic black knot. And then you can also apply preventative fungicide of lime, sulfur, or chlorothalonil in spring. So when you apply fungicides preventatively, it is recommended to do it in the spring before bud break, and that will give you the best results. And when I mention like good, clean like a clean knife. It's good when you are pruning, anytime you're pruning an infected area, just to sanitize your pruning equipment between cuts. So it'll take a lot longer, but that's going to keep you from spreading the disease even more throughout the plant. So you can get store-bought garden sanitizer, you can get diluted, you can make your own dilution of alcohol or bleach solution just to make sure that you're not spreading the disease further into your plants. Cedar apple rust is a real common one in this area. They're really characteristic, these like kind of yellow-orange spots that'll be fuzzy, and then on the underside of the leaves on an apple tree or crab apple tree will have these little like fungal spores, these orange fungal spores. And this particular kind of rust needs two hosts. So it needs the juniper or the cedar tree and the crab apple or apple tree. And so in the spring, you see these gelatinous horned galls forming, this top left picture on this cedar or juniper tree. And then that is wind blown to infect the surrounding areas, crab apple and apple trees, and they can actually spread for up to 2 miles. So one way that people try to slow the infection is by removing cedar and juniper trees in the area, but unless all your neighbors are on board or you have like a large piece of land, that can be pretty ineffective. So the best way is to plant resistant varieties. So definitely doing your research. We see a lot of different wilts, and so this can sometimes be verticillium wilt, which is a kind of fungal infection, which you'll see the picture on the left, which if you cut into a branch, if you see your tree wilting, you can cut into the branch and see if the xylem is brown and decayed. This can be a sign of verticillium wilt. There's not as much you can do about this besides pruning back the infected area. So just pruning until you see that there's no more infection. But it could be also a sign of an abiotic condition if you see wilting. Maybe it's not getting enough water, or it's girdled, so it's the circulation is being cut off and the tree or plant isn't getting enough nutrients up. So you can check for proper planting, signs of girdling of the roots, and making sure that it's getting the water that it needs. Root rot in particular is pretty common with lawns. So if you have standing water in an area or you're not getting enough sunlight for the type of turf that you see or the type of plants that you see, this can lead to root rot, and you can just dig up a piece of turf or your plant to see. I actually just helped someone who had root rot with a butterfly bush. So it can happen to pretty much anything. Because of too much watering or standing water, or if your plants are like right up against the house or near a downspout, this can happen. So the best thing you can do is just not plant there or divert the water to another location. Sometimes you'll need fungicide if it's in your turf. You might have to aerate and then apply fungicide, because then the fungicide is getting into the roots. And so that's easier done by a professional. Yeah, and stem rot, you can identify that just by breaking into the stem to see if it looks rotted. And really, at that point, it's hard to recover from that. Mostly, it's just because they were watered too often. So too much love for those plants. Does anybody have any questions?
Don's wondering if you could expand on what pathogens are.
Yeah, so when I say pathogens, I'm thinking about any living or biotic vector, so anything that's transmitting the disease. So it can be the fungus, it can be bacteria, virus, or a pest. And the pest can actually transmit viruses and things like that. So any living vector of disease is what I mean by pathogens.
Carolyn would like to know how to eliminate powdery mildew on phlox.
On phlox, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Oh, okay. So to the best of my knowledge, it's the same for anything. To eliminate powdery mildew, just make sure that there's no standing water in the area. Make sure that the plants are getting the right amount of water. And then you can use a fungicide like a copper or sulfur-based fungicide. If you're noticing it just like a certain time of year, you can kind of take note of that pattern that you're seeing and start to, if it's something that's happening every year, and start to apply your fungicide, your copper sulfur-based fungicide, just a few weeks ahead of time, and then apply it about once a week until the time that you don't need to apply it. So prevention is key, but if you already have it, then you can apply the fungicide and just make sure that it's getting airflow. So I've read some places that you can just, if possible, put a fan or something to like get air circulation. That's the main thing, is get air circulating, and you can apply and prevent it with fungicide. So this is some bacterial diseases. So bacteria comes in and infects through wounds or natural openings in plants. It amounts for about 15% of plant diseases. So most of them are fungal infections, but a smaller amount are bacterial infections. They can spread through water splashing, pruning tools, insects, or even the seeds. So it starts at the beginning, right? So it starts with choosing the right plant, putting that plant in the right location, getting your seeds from a trusted source, or your plants. Bacterial infections show themselves through shoot dieback. So this fire blight, you'll see this very characteristic shepherd's crook of kind of wilting of one of the branches or a few branches, and the death of those leaves on that branch. And how you can help this is by pruning 6 inches below the infection, and again, sanitizing between cuts. Also, whenever you prune when it's dry out, so that you're not spreading the infection further, because again, fungal infections and bacteria really spread easier with water. Bacterial infections also show up with leaf spots. So if you have leaf spots, it could be a fungal infection or a bacterial infection. What's pretty characteristic about bacterial spots, if you see this picture on the bottom left of this lilac bush leaf, is you get what we call this shot hole appearance, because these leaf spots are necrotic or dead in the middle. And so then those fall out, and so you get actual holes in your leaf. So that can be a bacterial infection. Also, black rot happens sometimes because of a bacterial infection that happens to crucifers. So things like cabbage, collard greens, broccoli, cauliflower can get black rot. It looks a little bit like anthracnose. So it has this like browning of the edges. The edges get crispy. The leaves don't grow in appropriately, and you can check to see if it is black rot by breaking into a stem and seeing if the xylem inside the stem are rotted. So you see the picture right next to the cabbage on the bottom, you can see that example. And so for this, to avoid and prevent these conditions, because prevention is key, you want to weed the area of your planting, avoid overhead irrigation, so water at the base of the plant, and only sprays with copper or streptomycin will work for these bacterial infections. So it's a little bit more picky for what will work. And again, fungicides, these sprays are preventative. So it won't fix the problem that's already there, but it'll prevent it from spreading. Bacterial wilt is specifically caused by the cucumber beetle. So this is a type of wilt that happens in cucurbits, or the family that has squash and pumpkins and cucumbers. If you see this picture in the middle right, you see just wilting. Your cucurbits just aren't doing so well. You need these cucumber beetles to cause this wilt to happen, and you can tell that that's what you're dealing with if you see the actual cucumber beetles, which are on the bottom right, or if on the left you can cut into the stem and actually see the bacteria streaming through the cut stem. So it's like a gooey chocolate chip cookie, but with bacteria. Yum. So you can actually, the only way to control this is to prevent the cucumber beetles from getting to your crop. So you can use floating row covers, like in the picture in the top right. So it's just like a low tunnel system with like a lightweight, light colored landscape fabric. And then if you have an infection, you can keep it from getting worse by using like neem oil, which is an organic option. So I'm actually going to skip the question part for this section and go right into the next section because it's short. So viruses are, it's very short. Viruses are spread by grafting, infected plants, insects, nematodes, humans. So we can actually transmit viruses. There's a story of smokers smoking cigarettes and then infecting their tobacco plants, and I think other plants too in the same family, with a tobacco virus because their tobacco had a virus that they were smoking. It accounts for only about 5% of plant diseases, and they're systemic. So once they're infected, there's no cure, but it doesn't necessarily mean that your plant is not going to make it. It's just infected by this virus. So these are really interesting looking to me. You can see they come up as these really strange, like spirally, funky colors on the leaves, and this can happen on all different kinds of plants. There's not much that can be done about them, but once the plant is infected, they do require more winter protection. They become a little bit more fragile. So really your best bet is to either deal with the condition by protecting them or remove the plant, and don't plant anything from the same family in that area for a few years. You can submit a sample to be diagnosed through a plant diagnostic lab, but even if they can tell you what it is, there's not much you can do about it, unfortunately. Are there any questions at this point?
Can anyone comment on using diluted soap as a foliar spray to deter pests? That's from Tim.
So I can say that it's not something that I'm able to recommend, just because I haven't seen like research on it, but I do know some people that use it that have found it to be useful. Specific pests, we see caterpillars. So we have the cabbage worm, cabbage looper, diamondback moth, all shown here. And these specifically affect crucifers. So are things like our broccoli and cabbage and cauliflower. You don't normally see the actual caterpillar, but you'll see the holes that they leave behind. You'll see their frass or their insect poop is just these little black dots on the leaves. And one way to find the caterpillar is if you see the frass, look up. Chances are the caterpillar is right above that frass, either on the underside of a leaf or on the stem. And you can treat these by using BT, or Bacillus thuringiensis, which is a bacterial spray, and a bacterial pesticide that is considered organic, and that will react with the gut pH of the caterpillars and not negatively affect other pests, other insects, or humans. Squash bugs, vine borers, and cucumber beetles. So these guys all affect cucurbits, which are pumpkin, squash, cucumbers. Squash bugs and cucumber beetles are really obvious. You'll actually see the physical insects. When they're large, you can pick them off and put them into soapy water. So that's one way to use detergent that I can talk about, is if you can pick them off of the leaves and put them in a jug of soapy water when they're big. When you see eggs, you can just squash the eggs. And when you see the nymphs, which you see in this top right picture of squash bugs, they're like kind of teenage squash bugs, I guess. You can use insecticides to treat them, and those are listed here. For the vine borer, you'll actually see on the bottom left, this vine borer, you'll just see your plants wilting, and you'll see sawdust on the stem, what looks like sawdust, but you won't know what's going on because you can't see the insect. So you can break into your stem and you'll see this vine borer, and you can treat it with those same insecticides. Scales and aphids are really common. If you notice ants around the base of your tree or around the base of your plant, it could be that you have honeydew, because the ants are attracted to the honeydew, which is excreted by the scales and the aphids and a few other insects too, but the scales and aphids are most common. You'll also see sooty mold, which is from the honeydew being on the leaf and plant surfaces. And the honeydew is usually just like dripping off of the plant. It's like a wet, sticky substance that the scales and aphids secrete. And so you can treat both of these conditions using neem oil, insecticidal soap, or horticultural oil. And you can also further treat aphids using these other options. Japanese beetles, you'll have the characteristic kind of lacy look that when they eat the leaves, and these guys are just really big and obvious. So when you have damage, usually they're right there, you can see them. And and you can just pick them off, put them in soapy water. But when you don't see them, there'll be grubs in your turf. So that is something to consider, is if you have Japanese beetles around, you might have grubs in your turf that can do damage on your turf. And you can use neem oil or a few other insecticides on your plants, but remember to follow the label, and that's true for any use of pesticides. So follow the label and make sure, if you are using it on vegetables, to follow your harvest restrictions and your re-entry restrictions, because they'll tell you on the label how many days or how many hours until you can harvest again for safety, or how many days or hours until you can go back into your garden. Traps for beetles are not recommended, because you'll call all the Japanese beetles to your yard by using those traps instead of actually taking care of the population like you intended. So not recommended. Spider mites are really small. You don't usually even see them with the naked eye. You need like a microscope to see them. So the pictures on the right, you see this like discoloration because they're sucking the juices out of the leaves. So they're sucking out the green coloring from the leaves, the chlorophyll. And so you'll end up with this kind of mottled yellow or brown look to the top of the leaves, and sometimes the undersides of the leaves as well. And when you have really bad conditions, sometimes you'll get this web covering. So that's their name, the spider mites. That's where that comes from. The main thing is to conserve natural predators. So if you can avoid using insecticides at all possible, that's ideal. You can spray the plants with water to just knock the mites down. So a high pressure water spray, or if needed, use any of these insecticides listed. Borers, sapsuckers, and pine moths are all issues. So we'll see holes in pine trees, and the pine trees aren't doing so well. The two pictures on the right, the one on the top right is from a borer or bark beetle, and the one on the bottom is of a sapsucker, which is actually a kind of bird similar to a woodpecker that's trying to get the sap and also the insects under the bark. If you have a sapsucker, you can spray them with water. So I guess kind of like a cat or like a bad animal, spray it with water. And you can also use reflective tape or mylar balloons. You can put a mesh screening over the tree, but don't plug the holes or paint over the tree, because it's going to disrupt the natural healing process, just like with cankers or other injuries on the tree. Don't cover it. If you do have trees that have less than half of their healthy branches left, it is recommended to remove them. If you have insects, or borers or pine moths, then it's recommended to remove the trees between October and April, which is when the insects are actually inside the tree. So then you're removing the problem altogether. You can also use insecticides, so make sure you're spraying on the holes and around the holes. So it's easier to get a professional, if possible, to just spray the whole tree. The Zimmerman pine moth is the picture on the left. You see these kind of buildups of gummy sap, which is that sawdust outside of the holes that they burrow into. I put ants in here because I get a lot of calls about ants, and ants, unless they're inside your house, are typically not an issue. They can be a sign that something else is happening, like they're attracted to honeydew. So you might have aphids or scales if they're at the base of your tree or in your vegetable garden. They burrow into decayed wood, so sometimes they will burrow into trees, but they don't usually harm the trees. They're just removing the decayed wood. They're not actually eating any of the tree. They just remove the decayed wood and they live in the tree. If they do get into your house to get to your food or your pet's food, you can prevent them from getting into your house by sealing any openings in your home or your mortar foundation. Prune any tree branches that are overreaching your house, moving firewood farther away from your house. And there are insecticides and traps you can use, and you can rake their ant hills just to keep them from getting too close. If you do see them in your lawn or your garden, they'll actually manage your insect pests. So they're actually good guys here. Galls are very unsightly to some people. They're insects or other pathogens attaching themselves to the leaves or to the branches on your trees or other plants. And then the gall itself is actually plant tissue forming over that pest to protect itself. So it can be caused by feeding of bacteria, fungi, or insects. They don't usually severely harm the tree, except in the case of horned or gouty gall on oak trees, which can girdle branches, so cut off their restriction. So it is recommended to prune and remove those as soon as possible. So the horned oak gall is on the bottom left picture here. It's also recommended to remove the ash flower gall, which is in the middle, but these other common galls like the grape leaf gall, hickory leaf gall, maple bladder gall, you can just leave those be, and be patient with natural predators, because the natural predators will take care of the insect pests themselves. If you do really just want to get rid of them, you can use these listed insecticides, but it's recommended not to apply over the whole tree. Leave some galls non-treated at the base of the tree, because then those natural predators will keep coming back. The emerald ash borer, I have to mention, a lot of people ask, is it time for our ash tree to, is it time for our ash tree to be done? Well, I put this website link at the bottom of this site. It's extension.entm, which is entomology.purdue.edu/EAB, emerald ash borer, to learn more. And it's where I got this picture on the bottom left, which shows you when it's time to get rid of your tree. So when your tree has less than 30% of its branches left, it's about time to get rid of it. If you have an ash tree, you should probably be treating it with a professional arborist, treating your tree, because the emerald ash borer is just so pervasive throughout the area. They're really characteristic. If you have problems with your ash tree and you see this D-shaped exit hole on the bottom right coming out of your bark, chances are you have an emerald ash borer. I want to throw in here voles, which are a kind of little mammal. It's a small mammal that will eat plant matter. So they'll get into your vegetable gardens, they'll munch on your trees and your ornamentals, as opposed to moles, which are other small mammals that eat insects. So they can also tear up your turf, tear up your lawn with their little runways, their tunnel ways, but they're not going to eat your plants, so you don't have to worry about them as much, whereas the voles will actually get into your garden. You can repel them with capsaicin-based hot sauce, so that is a home remedy that has been shown scientifically to work to repel these guys. Also, mowing and keeping brush piles out of the way will give them less space to burrow in. Mulch lightly, so don't mulch as deeply. That gives them less room to burrow in and make their homes. You can also exclude them from your gardens and your planting areas with 1/4-inch hardware cloth around your plants, buried 4 to 6 inches, because they are burrowing. It's also legal to capture them, but if you are releasing them, you have to release them on a private property that you do have permission to release them on. So you can't release them into like a state park or something. Rabbit and deer damage looks pretty similar. These two pictures at the bottom, deer and rabbit damage. Deer don't have top incisors, so they'll kind of have like a tearing bite for the plant, whereas the rabbits do have top incisors, and so they have more of a clean cut. So you can prevent rabbits from making their home by removing brush piles and eliminating access to under deck areas. You can keep both deer and rabbits out of your yard by protecting with fencing. You can also use deodorant soap or capsaicin, again, some home remedies for repellents, and you can also buy some store-bought repellent. Yeah, and you do need a nuisance wild animal control permit to shoot or trap these guys, or a hunting license during the right game season. So you can't just go trapping rabbits, you have to have a permit. And so with that, I'd like to leave some closing remarks, some questions to ask yourself when you're trying to diagnose your own plant common garden ailments. What kind of plant is this? What conditions does this plant need to survive? How long has the plant been at the site? You know, is it just been there a really short time and it has maybe some transplant shock, or has it been there a long time? When did symptoms first appear? Is it a lasting condition? Because if you've had a condition for a long time, you're more likely to have to start using those, to be recommended to start using those preventative fungicides and things like that. What were the weather conditions? Because again, these diseases really are affected by weather conditions. So it might be that everybody's having these common issues. Has there been any site disturbances, construction, a lot of foot traffic? Has there been fertilizers or pesticides used on your plantings or nearby, maybe some nearby your neighbors or nearby farm fields that you might have some herbicide drift? Are any other plants affected? And what are the patterns that you see? So is it just one plant? Is it all the plants in one area? Is it just one species of plants? Have you done a soil test? A lot of times it's soil issues, issues of pH, issues of nutrient deficiencies, or girdling, where your plants aren't getting the nutrients that they need, or maybe watering too much or too little. So these are questions to ask yourself. Also knowing your host, because sometimes plants look sickly or like something's wrong, even if it's just the way that they look. So thinking about, you know, is that tree supposed to have sloughing bark? Is that evergreen actually a deciduous tree? Is that cultivar supposed to have variegated leaves? Is it supposed to be yellow? Is it just the old growth that's dying, or is it actually new growth? And then that becomes more of a concern. And some overall tips: plant appropriately. So do your research before you plant something. I've learned that unfortunately I can't plant some of my favorite trees in my yard because it's just not the right environment for them, and that's okay. Keep the plant healthy, mulch, water, and fertilize appropriately as needed. So not just because, make sure that it's needed. Otherwise you can be causing some other issues. So use your soil test, monitor how much rainfall you're getting, irrigate properly, irrigate at the base, not overhead or with sprinklers. Really the only time you should use sprinklers to water is for your turf. Scout, monitor, and diagnose early so you can catch these issues and treat them before you lose your plant, and always follow the label for your pesticide or fertilizer to make sure you're applying appropriately to the right kind of plant and you're being safe. And I have this picture of Rosie Lerner because she's our awesome horticulture specialist on campus that I ask all my questions to. So if you ever have any questions, you can ask me, and if I don't know the answer, I can ask her. And here's just some good tips for assessing your own plant issues. So if you don't want to come to me, or you want to, you know, take a turn handling it for yourself, just use trusted internet sites or books. So you can actually type into Google or whatever search engine you use, extension leaf spots, extension bacteria or something, and then it'll pull up extension resources. Or you can type in leafspots.edu, and if you type in that .edu, you're going to get scientific resources, not just blogs that Jane Doe put out. But you know, everybody's gardening experience is so valid, but we just want to make sure we're using the most current research-based tools, because they're there, and gardening is always changing, our environment is always changing, so it's good to be on top of that. Also, we do have the Plant and Pest Diagnostic Lab through Purdue, where you can submit samples. And so I put a link here on this page, so you can go online, and they have these forms you can print out and instructions on how to submit a sample, and they're great at getting back to you just within a few days on your actual diagnosis. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for your time and ask if you have any further questions. And also, here's my contact info. Feel free to get a hold of me anytime. I know that I didn't get to the weeds. Someone had asked about weeds being worse than normal. A lot of times weeds invade areas where the turf or the planting area isn't lush. So we get a lot of turf weeds because of compacted soil. So if we can create soil that's not as compacted, either by walking around and diverting foot traffic, or just making our planting area more healthy by watering it appropriately, aerating your turf if you're using turf, overseeding. Well, thank you all for taking your time to come to this presentation. And I know like it's hard to cover so much information in such a short amount of time, but I'd be happy to talk with people individually about issues that you're having in your gardens. Just feel free to reach out. Thanks, everyone.